Tab 5 includes chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 is all about listening. So it starts by talking about why listening is important, and it talks about how it builds your knowledge, it helps you build better relationships, it helps fulfill your communicative responsibility and avoid passivity syndrome. But most importantly, listening is important as an audience member because it allows you to actively engage in what the speaker is sharing. And within relationships, if you can actively listen to what your other half of the relationship is saying, so whether that's your significant other, your friend, your family member, your parent, your child, the better you listen, the stronger that relationship is going to be because it allows the other person to feel valued, feel what they have to contribute is important, and to feel like you care about them and what they have to say. So there are 5 steps to the listening process. The first step is receiving, or I also like to call that the hearing step. So a lot of people confuse hearing and listening. They may be similar, but they are very, very different. At its heart, all hearing is data and messages being received by your auditory canal, by your auditory passage, by your ears. That's all hearing is. When you choose to listen to what you are hearing, then you go through the listening process, and that assigns that data meaning and allows you to be able to interpret what you are hearing. So the first step is receiving or hearing, and that is when you receive messages and into your ears. Then the next step of the process is attending. That is when you choose to attend, choose to pay attention to the messages you are receiving. So if you are in a crowded mall, for example, sitting at a food court, you are going to hear lots of noises. You are going to hear people walking around, chairs being pulled out, exhaust fans from the restaurants, who knows what else, babies crying, other things. But when your best friend starts talking and you choose to listen to them and block out everything else, at that point in time you are attending to the messages they are sending, to interpret the messages they are sending. Then that takes us to step 3, which is understanding. And that is when we assign meanings to the messages we are attending, paying attention to. So that is when we process the words that are being said and what they mean to us. That is when we are essentially, this is when you think of how you listen, this is the step that's actually listening. Because you're actually processing the information you chose to pay attention to, and that is what step 3 is all about. Step 4 is responding, and that is when you in some way, shape, or form send a message back to the person who originally sent the message to you. And that can be anything from a nod of the head, eye contact, a facial expression, a verbal acknowledgement, okay, yeah, or ooh, or an actual message that sucks, I see what you're going through, any of those types of things. Even no response that is easily interpreted, a blank stare or a yawn, is still sending a message. However, if you don't have a clear response sent back, then the person sending the message may feel like you aren't actually listening to them. And then the final step is remembering, and that is when, even if it's for a short period of time, you actually remember what you just listened, what you just heard, attended, interpreted, and responded to. There are 4 types of listening. I like to call these reasons for listening. The first is appreciative listening, and that is when you are just listening to appreciate what you're hearing. That can be a story, that could be a movie, a television show, very often music. You listen to appreciate it. The second form of listening is empathic listening, when you are listening for an emotional response or emotional support. So you usually or most commonly would do this when a person you care about is sharing a story with you, whether it's about a bad day they had at work or how hard they studied and the great grade they got on an exam, or about somebody whose partner just broke up with them. Whatever it may be, when you are listening for emotional support, that's empathic listening. Informative listening is when you are listening for information. You are listening to learn. In your classes, during trainings, when you are being given directions, anytime you are listening to get information, you are doing informative listening. Then the last one is critical listening. And critical listening is when you listen carefully to a message in order to judge whether it is acceptable or not. So a lot of times you do critical listening when you're listening to politicians, or when you're listening to complaints, or anytime you are judging what you are listening to, whenever you are saying something is acceptable, not acceptable, good or bad, you are critical listening. So these are the 4 reasons people choose to listen to things, but they are not exclusive of one another. So you can be listening for emotional support, but still judging them in your own head. You may not share those judgments with them, but you're still judging them a little bit, which means you would be both empathic and critical listening. Or you can be listening for information and still to learn more about a friend, but still also listening for emotional support. Or a lot of times when you're listening for appreciation, you're also critical listening. So when you're trying to decide whether or not a song is good or bad, you'd be both listening for appreciation and critical listening. There are major things that stop you from being able to actively listen. These things are all called noise. There are 2 larger umbrellas types of noises, and then each of those are broken down to more specific types of noises. So the first one is internal noise. So internal noise is anything that you as a listener are doing or thinking that distracts you from listening to what the other person is saying. So the first kind is physiological noise. And so this is when your basic needs, your bodily conditions are not being met, so you can't actively listen. So if you haven't eaten for 2 days and I start giving a speech about how to make macaroni and cheese, you are going to be more concentrating on how hungry you are than you are on listening to me on how to make macaroni and cheese. Or if it's 30 degrees in a room that when you are listening to a speech, or 120 degrees when you are listening to a speech, you are going to be more concerned about being too hot or too cold than you are on actively listening to the speaker. The second type of internal noise is psychological noise. So that is any time your brain is thinking of anything other than in understanding and listening to the message that's being said. So as soon as you start thinking of how you're going to respond to what somebody said, you are no longer actively listening. Anytime you start thinking about other things you'd rather be doing, or other things you could be doing, or anytime you disagree with what they are saying, anytime you have any thought other than actively listening and understanding what the other person is saying, that is psychological noise. Then you have the external noise. So environmental external noise is what most people think of as noise. That's the air conditioner that's going, the car horn that's honking, other people talking, other people clapping, other people shifting in their seats or snoring, or any noise that's existing in your environment, any physical sounds that are existing that can distract you is environmental noise. You also have linguistic noise, which I like to also call behavioral noise. But that is anything that the speaker does that distracts you from the message. So maybe they over gesture too much, or maybe they don't have strong speaking skills, so they talk too fast or too slow or too quiet or too loud, or maybe they have a really thick accent. Any of those things can distract the listener from being able to listen to the message that the speaker is sending. So linguistic is anytime the speaker does something, whether it's through their own vocals or their own physicalities, that distract the listener from actively listening. So as a speaker, what can you do to help the audience listen better? Well, if you can know your audience and create an effective message that is something that they're going to want to listen to, that is going to increase your likelihood of them staying engaged. You want to be confident, meaning that you want to, the more you practice and the stronger of a speaker you are, and the more confidence you show, the more likely they are going to be engaged in what you're saying. Any way that you can control the environment, that will help. A really loud air conditioner, see if you can shut it off. If it's too hot in the room, see if you can open a window. Listen to your audience, which is something I will do as an instructor quite often. When I notice that my students are starting to fall asleep or starting to get a glazed over look, I switch things up. So listen to your audience, interpret what they are doing, and anytime you can make a change or an adjustment to your speech, it will help keep them engaged. And then keeping in mind cultural differences and cultural distinctions, and trying to tailor your speech that you can give a message that will speak across cultures, that will also help ensure that the audience will stay engaged. As an audience member, what can you do to listen effectively? There are two things: listen actively and listen critically. So listen actively means you give them your undivided attention. Anytime noise starts to interfere with your ability to listen to the speaker, you do your best to ignore it or push it aside and bring your attention back to actively listening to what the speaker is saying. And then also listen critically, meaning don't ever take the speaker at their word. Make sure that they are supporting what they are saying with credible sources and with oral citations, and that you do question it when there's something that doesn't quite make sense. Something important to note too is that being an active listener is hard. It is impossible to actively listen 24/7, 365, or even 24/1, or even an hour. Actively listening for a full hour is incredibly hard to do because there are so many different forms of noise that can affect your ability to actively listen. The standard college student in 2014 had an average attention span of 7 minutes, meaning that if the teacher didn't do something different in 7 minutes, that the audience would get lost and stop listening to them. So make sure that you do your best to continue to actively listen whenever it is important. None of the speeches I'm assigning you go over that 7-minute mark, so we should all be able to actively listen to a speech in this class if that ever becomes an assignment that you choose to take. So that is the end of this presentation, which also is the end of chapter 5, which means you can, or the end of tab 5, chapter 11, which is part of tab 5. So this wraps up tab 5. So after this lecture, please feel free to take the quiz for tab 5. And I will be back soon with my next lecture, which will be on tab 6, which is just one chapter, but it's all about the informative speech, which will then lead me into assigning the informative speeches for this class. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, do not hesitate to contact me, and thank you for listening to this lecture.